Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I feel it is appropriate that I describe the Woodman Point area as I remember it when I was growing up, and my association with the quarantine station. That would later become a fascination and a future passion of mine to unlock the chapters of its past history and sometimes tragic events in what I prefer to describe as the hidden community. I would also like to thank Mallee and the other members of the City of Cockburn for the opportunity to speak on the former Woodman Point Quarantine Station, a site of incredible history and heritage, but sadly very little of which is known by the public of Western Australia. My name is Earle Seubert and I'm the Honorary Historian of the Friends of Woodman Point Recreation Camp, and hopefully I can do justice in describing not only my childhood memories of the area as I remember it, but also this fascinating location with its historic past and unique history. Visualise, if you will, the year is 1952, and I still vividly recall being driven along in the family Vauxhall along what was then called Noble Base Road on a hot summer's day with my parents and grandmother to go swimming in an incredibly pristine area south of Woodman Point, namely Jervis Bay. On the way I can still remember us passing the Rob's Jetty meatworks with the sheep and cattle housed in the paddocks alongside the road, and then further on the South Fremantle Power Station, and waiting at the rail crossing for a steam train to pass by. Travelling further south past the Anchorage butchers, the hide and skin sheds with that unmistakable aroma, and then we go past Poole's shop at Coogee Beach and seeing the myriads of families picnicking on the lawn or sitting under bush-covered roof shelters. Further on we pass the derelict Coogee lime kilns, and opposite them the red corrugated iron fence of the Woodman Point Explosive magazine, with the empty railway carriages standing idle outside. Then we could see the staff cottages of the explosive depot with the heat shimmering off the corrugated iron roofs. Next to them the unique wooden houses that were taken over by the Navy during World War II, and this one, shown, was requisitioned by the government and used as a residence for the naval officer who was in charge of the workers who loaded munitions at the naval base jetties. Prior to that it was the residence of Jack Mayers and his family. Jack was the appointed engineer at the quarantine station after World War I had ended. On our left, the limestone sentinel of the Woodman Point Lighthouse, and the keeper's cottages directly in front and built close to the road. But something I remember well is that after we passed the lighthouse and continued on, we passed a road on our right, and my mother telling me down that road is a quarantine station. And on later occasions when we passed that road, I can still remember looking down and seeing in the distance a yellow flag flying next to a white timber cross gate. Just after the quarantine station road turn up on the left, many of you may have seen the remains of an old residence painted a drab brown and red in colour, and may have often thought, as I did, I wonder who used to live there. By the way, the colour you see the remains painted today came about by being used as a hospital insurance and television advertisement in the 1990s. The building was once a home of Jim and Millie Dean and their family. Jim Dean had the licence to harvest shell grit along that section of the coastline, and the outcome was a business that traded in not only the sale of grit for poultry feed, but also for the sale of shell grit for glass manufacture in the goldfields. Jim Dean's method of harvesting shell grit involved horses pulling the wooden filters to collect the grit along the water's edge, and then it would be manually put into hessian bags. I was told by Jim's daughter that he would water the horses at a freshwater spring that was situated just back from the water's edge in Jervis Bay. On the right of this image can be seen the schooner Abbey Mama up on the beach. The schooner came to grief during a storm in 1927, and sadly the remains of the schooner were later torched by persons unknown. I was told that the beach along this area at that particular time was described as being very isolated, in pristine condition, and a wilderness playground. It should also be mentioned that located just above the beach was the limestone obelisk or shipping cairn, keeping a vigilant watch over Jervis Bay. And this navigational marker was constructed between the years of 1872 and 1874 during a naval mapping expedition of Cockburn Sound and Gage Roads. Back in 1952 I still recall the old 10th Light Horse Army camp where the Woodman Point sewage plant is now located, and the camp at that time being used to house newly arrived migrants to Australia. It was just opposite here where we'd leave the car by the side of the road, go trudging through the very hot sand to the beach, carrying every conceivable thing for our beach excursion, and me looking for shadows thrown by the coastal shrubs to stand on the cooler soles of my feet. Very rarely did youngsters wear shoes in those days, and thongs were not heard of. Once on the water's edge, the beach would open up into a child's make-believe playground of simple pleasures. And seeing before me the rusty hull of a Dutch submarine K-12 just off the beach, and the burnt-out remains of what was left of the wooden schooner Abbey Mama. Then in anticipation and excitement of exploring and playing on the remains of an old wrecked tug, the Alacrity, while seeing the foreboding outline of the quarantine station silhouetted on the horizon. Pleasant childhood memories with my family such a long time ago. I regularly get asked why the fascination with the quarantine station, and when and first did you commence to research into its history? Looking back after World War II, my father was employed as postmaster at the Woodman Point Migrant Hostel. Point Walter Migrant Hostel, and quite often he would take me with him to work on Saturdays and during school holidays. Our family doctor during this time just happened to be Dr. John McGlashan, who made regular check-up visits to the Point Walter camp. Little did I realise then that these visits were health check-ups on contacts that had days earlier been released with a clean bill of health from the quarantine station. The doctor knew my father very well, and coincidentally, I have since discovered, was also an official Commonwealth Health Department doctor who regularly attended the Woodman Point Quarantine Station. The caption on this photograph from the West Australian in 1949 read, "The gate stays shut," and refers to passengers off the Miltown not to be released until their regulation period of quarantine detainment has been observed. Dr. McGlashan can be seen just to the right of the white quarantine sign. Some of you may remember Dr. McGlashan's surgery in the Chamber of Commerce building in Fillmore Street, Fremantle, where he was later in partnership with a Dr. Becker. I first became involved with the former quarantine station in the mid-1990s whilst taking photographs of the site, and became fascinated and intrigued by the unique buildings and noticeable apparent lack of knowledge of the site itself, and so commenced to research its history myself. It was then that it became obvious that very little was known of its past, including not only the personnel involved and the families that resided there, but also the persons whose final resting place would become Woodman Point. My passionate historic journey had begun only to discover that members of my own family also held official positions in the Commonwealth Quarantine Service, in particular an aunt who was married to an officer that was not only employed at Woodman Point Station, but also an officer in charge of the Bicton Animal Quarantine Station. In addition, the discovery of a previously unknown cousin, Mrs. Gail Dodd, who was also an avid historian and just by coincidence the niece of Dr. John McGlashan. Fate works in many ways, but I somehow feel I was destined to go down this path and research the quarantine station's history. At this time, I'd also like to express my appreciation of the invaluable assistance that was kindly given to me by original staff and family members who were employed and resided at the Woodman Point Quarantine Station, including management and staff of the Commonwealth Quarantine Service, the Department of Sport and Recreation, and the Department of Parks and Wildlife. Woodman Point's European naming was declared by Captain James Stirling in 1827 after the purser of the HMS Success, Thomas Woodman, and is often incorrectly titled as Woodman's Point. In fact, it should be Woodman Point. The area reserved for the Woodman Point Quarantine Station was originally designated for quarantine back in 1836, but the newly completed buildings in 1886 would not be officially used for quarantine purposes until 1887. The official quarantine area at that time covered 20 acres, and the official boundary of the quarantine station being marked by a limestone isolation wall that was erected back in 1886, with the successful tender being granted to a Mr. Whiteley to erect 19 chains of walling, extra foundations, and install 2 large gates. The limestone official boundary wall was described as being situated from sea to sea, thus directly across the Woodman Point Peninsula, from Jervis Bay in the south to Owen Anchorage Beach on the north side. In 1899, the founder of the Salvation Army, General William Booth, was confined to the quarantine station with suspected smallpox after the vessel, the Prince Regent Leopold, arrived at the Long Jetty Fremantle, but his condition was later correctly diagnosed as chickenpox. The authorities were so concerned with this ship having smallpox on board that the loading of 200 tonnes of coal was shot through 2 doors on the starboard side of the vessel whilst alongside the jetty, so there would be no human contact with the ship's crew. It was also during General Booth's confinement at Woodman Point, he wrote an article for the Bulletin, the War Cry, that describes vividly the quarantine station at this particular time. He writes, "A convict-built limestone wall in some decay enclosed the quarantine station and separated it from a vacant leper colony. A bell and a sign, 'Smallpox here,' hung on tall, forbidding gates. Another incident was where the General's son, Commandant Herbert Booth, was able to discuss some Salvation Army business over the limestone wall. Sadly, very little of this structure remains today." Prior to 1886, all confirmed quarantine cases were isolated on Carnac Island, and the additional contacts being housed on the hulks of vessels moored in an area designated as the quarantine anchorage, and this was situated between Carnac Island and Woodman Point in Owen Anchorage. But it wasn't until 1852 when 226 civilians and military personnel off the vessel the Anna Robertson were quarantined on Carnac Island suffering from whooping cough, but were eventually taken off the island because of water contamination and housed in tents on the beach at Woodman Point, and to the best of my research, these were the first people to be isolated at Woodman Point under quarantine regulations. It should be noted that persons were still isolated at Carnac Island into the 1900s, but during this period the selection process on how you were chosen to be isolated on Carnac Island appears to have depended on your racial background. While we're on the subject of Carnac Island, I should perhaps mention about the tiger snakes that inhabit the island and how they originally arrived there. For information, the species are completely unique, but the majority of the snakes are blind, and this being caused by seagulls pecking at the snakes when they invade the nest for their eggs or young chicks, but they also appear to have no natural enemies. The snakes presumably originated on the island from a travelling reptile show in the 1920s after the owner, Lindsay Rocky Vane, an entertainer and snake handler, was officially ordered to get rid of the reptiles after his wife, Mrs. Annie Vane, also known as Cleopatra by the way, was bitten and died from a tiger snake bite on the 13th of April 1928, and the same occurred to his business partner, William Melrose, on the 19th of February the following year after participating in a bat at the Buffalo Club in Perth, after he carried into the club 2 tiger snakes and a carpet snake in a bag, and I've been told the carpet snake affectionately answered to the name of Old Joe. Lindsay Vane, I described him as a fruitcake, however, Lindsay Vane was known to encourage the snakes to bite him with the idea of becoming immune to the venom. His show was eventually banned by the police and local authorities. The Minister of Justice and the acting coroner recommend the case be brought before the Minister of Justice with the object of banning snake exhibitions in this state. And this law being brought about by the unfortunate death of his assistant, William Melrose. It is then alleged that following this authorisation, Lindsay Vane and a fellow accomplice dumped his entire collection of tiger snakes on Carnac Island. There are other explanations that state how the tiger snakes originated on Carnac Island, but I prefer to agree that they arrived by this method because there is no reference or sightings of any snakes of any description referred to in any of the quarantine records during the time that Carnac Island was used extensively as a quarantine station from the 1850s through to the 1900s.
Is it only tiger snakes there?
Yeah. Possibly the first people to use the newly erected quarantine buildings was on the 29th of December 1886 when the ship Elderslie arrived at Fremantle with 2 cases of scarlet fever among the 127 passengers. Facilities at the quarantine station were unable to cope with this number, and the government engaged a cargo vessel, the Singalee, to provide additional quarantine conditions and accommodation for the contacts in the designated quarantine anchorage in Cockburn Sound. The original quarantine buildings were designed by George Temple Poole, who was superintendent of the architectural department in Western Australia and who designed many of the state's public buildings in the gold rush era of the 1890s. And the buildings were erected by J. Harwood and Sons between 1885 and 1886 at a total cost of £490. The quarantine station is steeped in history, and only now are certain facets of its history coming to light through our research. Surprisingly, there have only been approximately 61 people who have died at Woodman Point. I say approximately because there may be more, but the recorded deaths at the station are incomplete. We do know, however, that during its history, hundreds upon hundreds of contacts and confirmed disease cases have passed through the station itself, and at least 350 vessels have come under quarantine jurisdiction in Fremantle since its inception. It should also be mentioned that at the end of World War I, Garden Island was also utilised for recuperating cases of Spanish flu after they'd been isolated at the Woodman Point Station. It is estimated that 1 in 50 persons worldwide died from Spanish flu. The influenza appeared to only affect the fit, not the elderly or the young, and so virulent was this pandemic that you could feel completely healthy in the morning and be dead by tea time. This image shows recuperating soldiers in 1919 on the Woodman Point Quarantine Station jetty during the Spanish flu pandemic. These were most likely soldiers off the vessel Boona, who they called the Bloomin' Lake Brigade, as they were the last contingent of men destined for the Western Front, but the armistice was signed whilst the ship was en route in the Indian Ocean. The area shown here was allocated as the official metropolitan burial ground for smallpox and typhoid victims. And in addition, this location also contains the burial sites of bubonic plague victims that not only died at Woodman Point, but also that of plague-infected corpses that were transported to Woodman Point, especially for cremation, and the remains of some are buried in this area as well. The first person to die at Woodman Point was a William Miller on 21st of April 1893, suffering smallpox, and his remains are also buried in this area. William Miller was originally employed in the construction of Fremantle Harbour. With the Woodman Point crematorium being completed in early 1901, all deaths that eventuated from smallpox, typhoid, leprosy and plague were immediately cremated. The last cremation that took place at Woodman Point was that of a crewman named Osea Takova from the vessel Suva, and he died of smallpox on the 11th of April 1943. He was cremated together with 4 other crewmen who died of smallpox from the same vessel, and they were all buried in one grave at the Woodman Point Military Cemetery. The chief officer from this ship was Arthur Waters, and he had been attending the more serious cases of smallpox on the vessel whilst it was en route to Fremantle. It has been discovered that he was not vaccinated from smallpox, a certain death sentence, and he would eventually catch the disease, and he died on the 1st of April 1943. He was originally buried at Woodman Point, but in 1958 he was reinterred to Carnac Cemetery. On a memorial board in the Chapel of the Flying Angel Mission to Seamen, it named those who died off the Suva, and on it there is a notation to Arthur David Waters which states, "To the memory of a ship's officer who did more than his duty." There were 28 confirmed cases of smallpox on this vessel, and 6 would eventually die from the disease. The first happened on the voyage to Fremantle, and he was buried at sea. I'm currently in contact with members of the Arthur Waters family who still reside in Dover, Kent. I'm also of the opinion, because of the notation on his burial plaque in the niche wall at Carnac Cemetery and the total information blackout that was imposed at Woodman Point between the years of 1939 and 46, I doubt very much if members of his family were ever notified of the complete details of his death. His niece Janet has confirmed with me that his family believed that he was killed in the Pacific. He simply went to war and never came home. She also mentioned that the area where he lived was heavily bombed during World War II, and no doubt a notification was sent, but chances of ever receiving it were minor. Woodman Point Quarantine Station also housed the state's first bubonic plague hospital, described then as the most important building on site. It is so situated as to catch the sea breezes from the south and the west. To patients, the benefit of this position cannot be overestimated. The building is a commodious one and is made of galvanised iron with pine wood flooring, and the inside and outside walls are lined with corrugated iron, between which are layers of felt. This building will later be known as the Isolation Hospital. I should also note that the quarantine station has quarantined and isolated every disease from leprosy and plague through to venereal disease and smallpox. The Woodman Point Station also has the distinction of having the first leprosarium, and the first article of the so-called leprosarium appeared in the West Australian in September 1901 and described it as such. The building is by no means inviting, in fact the lazaretto being particularly so. The caretaker assured our representative that no leper had been confined in the lazaretto for many years, and for the credit of Western Australia, it is to be hoped that no unfortunate being, be his disease what it may, will be compelled to occupy such a place again. On 23rd of February 1903, another article was published in the West Australian under the heading The Local Leper, a personal interview which described the conditions in which John Higgins the leper was committed to. This 2-room structure was located in the centre of a sandy patch of land, enclosed on 3 sides by a galvanised iron fence, 14 foot high we've been told, and on the 4th by the limestone wall of the quarantine station. John Higgins died on the 9th of February 1906 after surviving nearly 3.5 years at the Woodman Point Quarantine Station in this so-called dwelling. The quarantine station also has Australia's first crematorium and was constructed at Woodman Point in 1900, specifically to burn plague-infected corpses from the plague epidemic that was affecting the metropolitan area, especially Fremantle, North Fremantle, Clermont and Perth. The first death from bubonic plague was that of a William Campbell, aged 19 years, who lived in lived in Colley Street, Fremantle, and presumably caught the disease whilst handling cargo at the No. 1 railway goods sheds. The cargo had been brought into the port on the steamers Pilbara and Marloo, and Campbell died in Fremantle Hospital on the 8th of April 1900. The acting principal medical officer, a Dr. Harvey, then ordered that the body be buried at sea about 20 miles from Fremantle. The second death occurred from bubonic plague outbreak in Fremantle at 4 o'clock on Thursday the 12th of April, and this being a Sydney Wilson, aged 43, an employee of Messrs G. Wood and Sons, merchant situated in Cantonment Street. The authorities deciding that in the matter of disposal of the body of the deceased, it will adopt a different course to that which was followed in connection with Campbell's body. Wilson's body will be taken to a position near the quarantine station, and the PWD dispatched 10 men to make preparations for the cremation. The Daily News stated hopes are entertained that the outbreak will be confined to 2 cases which have already been recorded. It was, however, not to be. Plague deaths continued to be recorded for another 4 years. Construction of a crematorium at Woodman Point was inevitable, and this image shows the crematorium as it is today. The quarantine station was also kept in a state of constant readiness, and at any one time the maximum bed capacity totalled 283, and quarantine staff consisted of 10 nurses, depending on necessity, and an on-duty Commonwealth medical officer. The Commonwealth quarantine officer stations at Woodman Point were rostered in turn to inspecting vessels in various ports, on-duty inspection roster at Perth Airport, and official duties at the quarantine station. I'd originally intended to speaking on a wartime incident describing what transpired when someone was diagnosed with smallpox on a vessel in Gauge Roads and what procedures and actions were immediately put into place after this occurred. On second thoughts, however, I came to the conclusion that I'd speak about the sad case of Sister Barbara Smith, or as she was formerly known, Mary Gertrude Smith, before she took her religious vows. On February the 11th, 1930, the Royal Mail ship Naldera arrived at Fremantle, and on board were passengers Mr. and Mrs. James Sharp, returning from India, and after leaving the ship in Fremantle, they travelled to North Perth, where they intended to stay with friends for a few days. On the following day, Mr. Sharp, a retired civil servant who had previously been indisposed on the ship, became ill at their friend's house, and a doctor was called in. The doctor diagnosed the case as suspected typhoid fever, and after ordering the patient to be removed to a hospital, notifies the authorities accordingly. Mr. Sharp is taken to St John of God Hospital in Subiaco, where each day he is visited by a doctor and also tended to by the nursing staff, including 5 sisters of St John of God, and amongst them is a 23-year-old sister from Midland Junction, Sister Barbara Smith. On Sunday the 16th of February, a doctor who was visiting the patient became suspicious and then called in another doctor to verify his suspicions. And after examination confirmed that it was undoubtedly smallpox, Mr. Sharp had been misdiagnosed and is suffering from the highly contagious disease of smallpox. The hospital now goes into complete isolation mode, and steps are immediately taken to have Mr. and Mrs. Sharp and another immediate contact transferred to the isolation hospital at Woodman Point Quarantine Station. On Monday the 17th of February, arrangements are made to have the 7 other contacts transferred to Woodman Point, and that includes Sister Barbara Smith, the other contacts being 4 sisters, 2 trained nurses, and another private patient from St John of God Hospital, Subiaco. Transference to the Woodman Point for the contacts is by way of the police van, or the Black Mariah it was described then, and was witnessed at the time en route to the quarantine station. On arrival, Sister Barbara is vaccinated immediately, seeing it is now discovered she is the only contact that hadn't been vaccinated in infancy. A yellow quarantine flag is immediately hoisted at the entrance gate to Woodman Point and other numerous notable positions around the boundaries of the quarantine station. And from that instant, the station goes into complete lockdown. Orders are given to fumigate the hospital in Subiaco, including the house the Sharps were staying in at North Perth, and also retrace their whereabouts and all persons they have come in contact with since their arrival. The 2 doctors associated with the case were vaccinated anew, and all other doctors who are on duty during this time are officially put under house arrest to contain any avenue of the spread of the disease. In the afternoon at St John of God Hospital, 100 additional nurses and members of the hospital staff are vaccinated. During this period of isolation, Mr and Mrs James Sharp will be hospitalised in the Woodman Point Isolation Hospital, where James Sharp will eventually succumb to the disease on the 22nd of February 1930. The other contacts are being hospitalised in the observation hospital at Woodman Point until confirmation of a positive diagnosis, where they'll be then transferred to the isolation hospital. After their arrival at the quarantine station, the 5 St John of God sisters spend their days of isolation assisting in the observation wards, doing religious chores, and also spending time on Quarantine Beach with daily prayers. On or about the 28th of February, Sister Barbara reports to be feeling unwell, but this is put down to a reaction to the vaccination, but will later be confirmed as full-blown smallpox. On confirmation of the disease, Sister Barbara should have been transferred to the isolation hospital, but a sympathetic decision by the head nurse at the time, namely Bertie Poor, allows her to stay in company with her other nursing companions in the observation wards. This man was later described by the sisters of St John of God as having the essence of kindness. Isolated in a ward in the observation hospital, Sister Barbara has her fluids delivered through a small sliding opening in the wall near her bed, and only the Sisters of St John of God being allowed to enter the room. Her condition deteriorates rapidly, and late on the 16th of March she is given the last rites through the window near her bed by a Fremantle priest. The newspaper reported it as such. It read, Sister Barbara, who was a member of the nursing staff of the St John of God Hospital, died from smallpox at Woodman Point Quarantine Station at 4:30am today. Sister Barbara will be cremated at 11am on the 17th of March and sadly obtained the distinction of being the first Roman Catholic to be cremated in Australia, but details of this appear to be not publicised. On the 19th of March 2011, a memorial service was held for Sister Barbara and was conducted by Sister Eugenia Brennan and the other Sisters of St John of God, and was organised by the Friends of Woodman Point Recreation Camp. I was privileged to attend the ceremony and can only describe the service as extremely moving. On the lighter side, however, and to any football followers who are amongst us, I'd like to tell of an incident that occurred in 1966, the 14th of February, in fact, of that year. Two South Fremantle footballers, namely Ian Darrick and Peter Dugan, and their coach John Todd, are beach training and happened accidentally, I'm told by Ian Darrick, to enter the strictly prohibited quarantine beach area, upon which they are arrested by a very officious ex-Navy officer and second in charge of the quarantine station, a Mr Wally Harrison. Mr Harrison then requests names and addresses, whereby he is given supposed residential addresses such as South Fremantle Power Station and the South Perth Zoo. Their replies only ignite proceedings, and seeing strict security must be maintained always near the boundaries of the station, and they have violated the quarantine area. Not only are they guaranteed a forthcoming fine, but 2 months sentence in Fremantle jail is extremely possible. They are informed. The latter sentence does not occur, but in Fremantle Police Court each were fined $4 and ordered to pay total costs of $10.90 each. Ian Darrick, who I know very well, told me that South didn't win a premiership that year, but maintains for the record they were the first people ever fined in decimal currency, and seeing this occurred on the 15th of February 1966, I tend to agree with him. To give you some idea how strict quarantine regulations were for breaching the security and quarantine boundaries, during World War II, 4 soldiers from the nearby army camp, just south of the lighthouse, were collecting firewood along the perimeter of the station and decided to jump the security fence with the obvious idea of increasing their firewood tonnage. And as everyone would know, there was far better quality firewood on the other side of the fence. The group are then arrested immediately by security and will spend the next 3 months in isolation. This incident happened during a strict quarantine smallpox lockdown in April 1943. Involving the Pacific trading vessel Suva. This vessel arrived at Fremantle with 28 confirmed cases of smallpox on board, and 1 death had already occurred prior to its arrival, and the victim had been buried at sea. I'd also like to mention during the soldiers' time of compulsory isolation at the quarantine station, one of the soldiers composed a poem dedicated to Miss Doris Dean, shown here. Doris was a volunteer worker at the station during the war years, and the poem was entitled The Bell of the Quarantine and was signed by the Woodcutters' Lament. Doris is still a member of our Friends Woodman Point group. It was in April 1979 when it was announced that Woodman Point was to close. The station was capable of confining hundreds, was no longer needed because isolation could be carried out at specific hospitals. From its beginning, the Woodman Point site has subsequently been used to quarantine against typhoid, enteric fever, cholera, scarlet fever, smallpox, leprosy, bubonic plague, pneumonic influenza, venereal disease, chickenpox, tuberculosis, whooping cough and measles, and to process hundreds of incoming service personnel, passengers, both air and sea, and their crews. During times of active quarantine, upwards of hundreds of persons were landed at Woodman Point and were subject to disinfection by bathing and showering, using Lysol and a form of tar soap. The quarantine staff and their families were regularly health checked and revaccinated. I feel it is appropriate to mention now there were reports from the passengers of the fear that prevailed amongst them when they were taken off their ship and herded into a shower block. Their clothes were taken from them and they were left to shower and wonder what was to happen next. Separating the males from the females and remembering the difficulties there must have been with numerous language problems, I'm told that pictures of the Holocaust were uppermost in their minds. Ships were also disinfected against contagion by spraying with formalin and cabins and compartments fumigated using methyl bromide. Since its time of installation around 1911, the autoclave or fumigator has been utilised for a variety of uses, including all fumigation requirements of commodities coming into WA by air and sea, and extensively used during the 40s and 50s with the post-war immigration, especially in 1949 when the arrival of the vessel Multan, and that included armed guards, barbed wire barricades on the wharf. In 1954, the arrival of the vessel Strathaired, and in this incident, 4 doctors worked round the clock revaccinating over 1,200 migrant passengers and ship's crew whilst the ship was in Gauge Roads. 1 confirmed case of smallpox and 59 contacts were taken to the Woodman Point Station, and Dr Young, a Commonwealth Health Officer, sailed with the ship to Adelaide as a health precaution. The autoclave's role also included fumigating everything from mailbag, cotton waste, clothing, bedding, even pig bristle, right through to poppy seeds. As a result of an amendment of the Immigration Act in 1958, the original observation hospital was converted to a detention centre for non-criminals, only one of 2 in Australia. Previously, stowaways, prohibited immigrants and ship's deserters were, as a rule, detained in state prisons pending their deportation. And for reference, there were many daring escapes, including roadblocks set up in the state and with state and Commonwealth police, including quarantine officers, combining in the search. Some escapes being successful, one in October 1968, which resulted in all daily exercise being withdrawn after this incident and the following month onwards. The detention centre was also utilised in the early 70s as a medical assessment receiving centre for Vietnamese refugees fleeing to Australia at the end of the Vietnam War, prior to them being transferred to the Greylands Migrant Hostel. Significant chapters worth noting throughout the station's history, apart from being the front line in quarantine and protecting WA from contagious diseases, are the bubonic plague epidemic of the 1900s, whereby a plague hospital was specifically built for this purpose and a crematorium erected to burn plague-infected corpses that were emanating from the metropolitan area. The crematorium would then hold the distinction as being the oldest in Australia. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19 and the sad loss of life of young soldiers and volunteer nurses at Woodman Point. Known as the Boona tragedy, this sad chapter took place at the end of World War I and involved the vessel HMAT Boona, a troop transport carrying the last contingent of reinforcement soldiers to the Western Front. When the armistice was signed, while the ship was in transit during its voyage across the Indian Ocean. The ship would continue on to Durban, South Africa, where the soldiers unhappily would be confined on board the now quarantined vessel at anchor in the middle of Durban Harbour. South Africa was very badly affected at this time with the deadly pneumotic influenza, and those on board would now come in close contact with those infected with the Spanish flu by way of port officials and shore-based labour who were loading the ship's bunkers from coal hulks moored alongside the ship. 29 soldiers would eventually die from pneumonic influenza at Woodman Point. The other vessel involved with this incident was the HMAT Wairima, and on board her were Australian Army nurses, of whom all would volunteer to assist at Woodman Point Quarantine Station, but only 20 would be selected to assist at the station during the Spanish flu crisis that would occur during the following months of 1919. Sadly, 4 of these nurses would pay the ultimate sacrifice. Over the decades, there's only been 14 deaths from smallpox. However, many have recovered at Woodman Point, having either been vaccinated in their childhood or from treatment by penicillin injection during the 40s. Normal procedures taken at Woodman Point after people were landed there with smallpox was as follows. They were processed and bathed and showered. Then penicillin in oil was administered intramuscularly, and their luggage was disinfected and fumigated. Apart from the numerous smallpox cases during the war years, the station's association with the 10th Light Horse that utilised storage sheds within the confines of the quarantine station, and confirmed reports that Z Special Force, who were based and operated out of Garden Island, also used Woodman Point area for military exercises. During the war years, all details relating to quarantine matters were kept confidential, and a total information blackout was enforced for all quarantine details between 1937 and 1946. In 1946, the Fremantle Harbour Trust released details of so-called plague ships to Western Australian newspaper, but in fact they were vessels with smallpox on board. This also included details of internment camps for various nationalities and, surprisingly, the possibility of a Japanese prisoner of war camp within the perimeter of the quarantine station boundaries. These details have been reported and documented to me from two separate individuals who had a close association with the Woodman Point Station close to and following the end of World War II. The post-war immigration, with the influx of large numbers of immigrants and displaced persons arriving from the United Kingdom and Europe, this meaning the Commonwealth Quarantine Service had to be continually vigilant and on constant alert with the early detection and the prevention of allowing numerous contagious diseases to enter the country. The quarantine station was officially closed in 1979, this demise being brought about mainly by the eradication of many of the contagious diseases, especially smallpox. From 1979 onwards, the station was no longer active but was used by various organisations such as scouting groups, school camps, various sporting groups, and then on the 15th of December 1982, the Minister of the Department of Sport and Recreation officially opened the Woodman Point Recreation Camp. In 1989, the original residence of the officer in charge of the quarantine station was used as a reprise by the Vietnam Veterans Association. Gradually the site became run down and degraded, and it was earmarked for demolition to make way for a proposed housing development. It was in 2002 the Department of Sport and Recreation had the foresight to see the potential of the area, and the old Woodman Point Quarantine Station was then declared a heritage listing. Seen here is the Isolation Hospital in 2013, fully restored and home to the Friends of Woodman Point Recreation Camp. And special thanks must be given to the state and federal governments, including Lottery West and the City of Cockburn, for not only their initial but ongoing support in maintaining this heritage-listed unique site. The former quarantine station continues to give up incredible stories of bravery and selflessness, and this has only been one of many historical and fascinating chapters that involve the Woodman Point Quarantine Station, and can only be described as a hidden historic treasure. This is truly an historic, fascinating chapter in Western Australia's quarantine past. And speaking of chapters, I'd like to advise that we are currently in the process of writing and compiling incredible amounts of historic information for a book to be published, and aptly titled The Hidden Community, A History of the Woodman Point Quarantine Station. Hopefully this presentation may entice your members or group to come on one of our heritage tours at the former Woodman Point Quarantine Station in the future, and details and information of which can be noted on our brochures here this afternoon. I would sincerely like to thank my number one here, Evelyn, for assisting me with this presentation, but especially yourselves for attending here today. Thank you very much.